Examine this photograph, if you will. A faded sepia image from 1896, depicting a modest homestead in Manti, Utah territory. The wooden house stands stark against the harsh landscape. 3 women pose stiffly on the porch, their faces betraying nothing of the horror that would soon unfold within these walls. The man standing behind them, one Ephraim Bennion, appears unremarkable. A devout pioneer, respected in his community, his countenance that of any God-fearing settler of the Mormon frontier. Yet this seemingly ordinary domestic scene conceals one of the most disturbing cases of familial murder in Utah's territorial history, a crime made all the more unsettling by the unusual domestic arrangements that characterized the final days of the Benyan household. The year 1896 was momentous for Utah, marking its transition from territory to statehood. What few outside this insular community realized was that this political transformation was predicated upon a profound social compromise. In 1890, Church President Wilford Woodruff had issued the manifesto, officially ending the practice of plural marriage, a practice that had defined Mormon family life for nearly half a century. This dramatic shift in doctrine created profound tensions within many households still living under polygamous arrangements. The Benyan household in Manti was one such family caught between eras, between the old ways and the new, between religious doctrine and secular law, between private belief and public accommodation. Plural marriage had been a cornerstone of Mormon religious practice since its secretive introduction by church founder Joseph Smith in the 1840s. The practice had driven the saints from Illinois and Missouri, motivated their arduous exodus to the isolated valleys of the Great Basin, and subsequently defined their conflicted relationship with the federal government for decades. The theological foundations of polygamy were embedded in the Doctrine and Covenants, specifically Section 132, which established, quote, celestial marriage as essential for achieving the highest level of exaltation in the afterlife. For generations of Latter-day Saints, plural marriage represented not merely a social arrangement, but a sacred covenant with profound implications for eternity. Thus, the manifesto's abrupt renunciation of this practice constituted far more than a mere policy adjustment. It represented a fundamental rupture in the spiritual worldview of thousands of devout believers. Documents preserved in the Church Historical Department reveal that the transition was neither smooth nor universal. In many rural communities like Manti, where isolation had fostered a particularly orthodox religious culture, plural marriage continued covertly, despite official prohibition. Local ecclesiastical leaders often tacitly sanctioned these arrangements, creating a complex social environment where public adherence to the new doctrine coexisted with private commitment to the old ways. This ambiguous situation placed extraordinary stress on families like the Benyans, who found themselves suddenly straddling 2 incompatible legal and religious frameworks. Among the meticulously preserved records in the Utah State Archives resides a leather-bound volume containing the official inquest into what newspapers of the day euphemistically termed the Manti Domestic Tragedy. The clinical language of the court documents does little to diminish the psychological horror of what transpired within that remote farmhouse during the bitter winter of 1896. According to sworn testimony from neighbors and surviving family members, Ephraim Bennion had taken his first wife Mary in 1872, following the established Mormon practice of the time. Their union produced 6 children, establishing a seemingly prosperous household in the harsh Utah landscape. In 1879, following church council and prevailing religious custom, Benyan took a second wife, Elizabeth, who bore him 4 additional children. The documentary record indicates that this arrangement, while challenging by modern standards, maintained a certain equilibrium for nearly 15 years. The dynamics between Mary and Elizabeth Benyan appear to have been relatively harmonious compared to many plural households of the era. Census records from 1880 and 1890 list both women as residing in the same dwelling, suggesting a living arrangement that required significant cooperation and mutual accommodation. According to the testimony of Manti resident Eliza Christensen, preserved in the Daughters of Utah Pioneers oral history collection, the 2 women had established clearly defined domestic territories. Mary maintained authority over the household economy, directing the preservation of food and management of stores, while Elizabeth assumed primary responsibility for the education of all the children, having previously served as a schoolteacher before her marriage. This arrangement reflected common patterns in successful plural marriages of the period. Historian Lawrence Foster, in his definitive study of Mormon family structures, documented the tendency for sister wives to develop specialized roles that minimized direct competition and fostered interdependence. The Benyan household appeared to exemplify this functional model until the introduction of the third wife disrupted its carefully maintained balance. It was Benyan's third marriage in 1890 occurring, notably, in the very same month as Woodruff's manifesto, that introduced the fatal element into this household. Sarah Benyan, 20 years Ephraim's junior, came to the family under circumstances that would later prove significant. According to correspondence preserved in the Daughters of Utah Pioneers collection, Sarah had been informed by medical authorities in Salt Lake City that she was barren, a devastating diagnosis in a culture that prized female fertility as both divine blessing and practical necessity. Nevertheless, Ephraim, believing he had received personal revelation directing the union, brought Sarah into his household as a third wife, a decision that would ultimately fracture the family's delicate balance. Sarah's premarital life, documented in fragmentary form through census records and church membership rolls, suggests a background marked by displacement and insecurity. Born Sarah Agnes Tanner in 1867, she was orphaned at age 7 when her parents succumbed to a typhoid outbreak that devastated their small settlement near Cedar City. Raised subsequently by a succession of relatives, her education was irregular at best. By age 18, she was working as a domestic servant in the household of Bishop Abraham Metcalf in Parowan, where she first encountered Ephraim Bennion during one of his frequent trading expeditions. Her acceptance of the plural marriage proposal may well have been motivated by economic necessity as much as religious conviction. The medical determination of her infertility, occurring shortly before the marriage, would normally have significantly diminished her prospects in a culture where a woman's primary value was often measured by her reproductive capacity. A series of letters exchanged between Sarah and her cousin in Cedar City, now preserved in the special collections of the University of Utah's Marriott Library, document her initial optimism about joining the Benyan household. "I have been received with kindness by both Sister Mary and Sister Elizabeth," she wrote in November 1890. "Brother Benyan assures me that my barrenness is no impediment to his affection, and that the Lord may yet open my womb if it be his will." Within 6 months, however, her correspondence reflects growing isolation and anxiety. "I find myself increasingly removed from the family councils," she confided in April 1891. "The children regard me with undisguised suspicion, and I often overhear Sister Mary instructing them to report my movements to her. Brother Benyan seldom visits my quarters now, explaining that the new laws make our relationship dangerous." Dr. Elias Woodruff, one of only 3 physicians practicing in San Pete County at that time, recorded in his private journal, now held in the special collections of Brigham Young University, observations about the progressively deteriorating atmosphere within the Benyan household. Called to attend to the youngest Benyan wife today, he wrote in February 1895, "Her melancholia has progressed to a concerning degree. She speaks of hearing voices and experiencing visitations during the night hours." The other wives regard her with transparent suspicion, particularly when she interacts with their children. The elder Mrs. Benyan requested I supply a sedative for her sister wife's nervous excitability. I prescribed a moderate dose of laudanum, though I confess certain reservations regarding the household dynamic. Subsequent entries in Woodruff's journal document his growing concern about Sarah's mental state, noting her increasing preoccupation with Old Testament narratives of barren women. "Mrs. Sarah Benyan engaged me in a most disturbing conversation today regarding the biblical Sarah and her handmaid Hagar," he wrote in September 1895. "She expressed the conviction that God requires extraordinary demonstrations of faith from women denied the blessing of motherhood. When I attempted to redirect the conversation toward more healthful topics, she fell into a trance-like state, muttering phrases in what she claimed was the tongue of angels. I have encountered similar manifestations among the more fervent religious enthusiasts. But Mrs. Benyon's demeanor suggests something more pathological than mere spiritual excess. The winter of 1895-96 was particularly severe in central Utah. Heavy snowfall isolated many communities for weeks at a time. The Benyan farm, situated 3 miles outside Manti proper, was effectively cut off from regular contact with neighbors from late December through mid-February. It was during this period of enforced isolation that the psychological tensions within the household reached their breaking point. According to testimony provided by 16-year-old Joseph Benyan, eldest son of the first wife, Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. He described finding her standing over his sleeping siblings late at night, just watching them, not speaking when addressed. On multiple occasions, the boy reported awakening to find Sarah in the family's root cellar, engaged in whispered conversations with unseen parties. The younger children, too, began to report disturbing encounters with their father's third wife. 10-year-old Emma Benyan testified that Sarah had taken her to the barn on at least 3 occasions in January 1896, questioning her at length about her dreams, and offering to open her eyes to see the angels. The child reported being shown strange symbols drawn in the dirt floor, which Sarah claimed were sacred signs known only to those chosen for special missions. When Emma mentioned these incidents to her mother, Elizabeth apparently confronted Ephraim, resulting in a household quarrel so severe that the children were sent to the cellar while the adults engaged in what Joseph described as loud disagreements regarding Sister Sarah's proper place. What makes this case particularly significant from a historical perspective is how it illuminates the complex social pressures exerted upon plural families during this transitional period in Utah's history. The 1896 statehood had required the formal abandonment of polygamy, yet thousands of existing plural marriages continued, creating a legal and social limbo for these families. Correspondence between Ephraim Bennion and his brother in Salt Lake City, preserved in the Church History Library, reveals the strain this situation placed on the household patriarch. "I find myself in an impossible position," Benyan wrote in December 1895. "The new state laws would brand me criminal for the family arrangements I entered into under sacred covenant." The first and second wives urge compliance with the manifesto through separation from Sarah, while she grows increasingly disturbed by such discussions. "I fear the consequences should I choose any available path." The letter continues with a disturbing premonition. Sarah speaks increasingly of Abraham's testing and of angels bearing flaming swords. "I discovered her last night with my hunting knife, claiming she was practicing for some divine mission whose details she would not disclose. I have removed all weapons from the house and instructed the elder boys to maintain watch during the night hours. I have written to Bishop Madsen requesting guidance, but the roads are impassable, and I fear his counsel will arrive too late. May God grant me wisdom in this terrible circumstance." On February 22, 1896, when a thaw finally permitted travel to the Benyan homestead, a neighbor, Hiram Jensen, discovered a scene that would haunt Sanpete County for generations. The bodies of Mary and Elizabeth Benyan, along with 7 of the children, were found in their beds, each having suffered fatal lacerations to the throat. Initial reports suspected an attack by transient laborers known to be traveling through the region. However, the discovery of Ephraim Bennion's body in the barn, positioned in what appeared to be a ritualistic manner with significant mutilation to the abdominal region, suggested a crime of more intimate nature. Jensen's sworn statement, preserved in the county archives, provides a harrowing account of the discovery. "Upon receiving no response to my calls, I entered the house through the kitchen door, which stood ajar despite the cold. The sight that greeted me defies Christian description. Blood had soaked through the floorboards of the upper rooms, dripping through to the ground floor in a steady pattern. I discovered first the body of Sister Mary, her throat opened so severely that her head was nearly separated from her body. In the adjacent bedroom lay Sister Elizabeth and 3 of her children, similarly dispatched. The remaining children, except for Joseph and the infant Rebecca, who were later found alive in the root cellar, lay in their beds as though sleeping, were it not for the terrible wounds inflicted upon them. The most disturbing discovery, however, awaited in the barn. Brother Benyan had been positioned upon a crude altar constructed from hay bales, his limbs secured with baling wire. His abdomen had been opened with apparent deliberation, certain organs removed and arranged in a circular pattern around his body. Upon the barn wall, written in what appeared to be the victim's blood, were inscribed the words, "As Abraham offered Isaac, so have I offered a more perfect sacrifice." I confess that upon witnessing this abomination, I fell to my knees in prayer before writing for the sheriff. The court records contain the transcript of Sarah Benyon's interrogation, conducted at the San Pete County Courthouse over 3 days in early March 1896. The document is remarkable for both its clinical detachment and its disturbing psychological insights. When questioned about the deaths, Sarah initially claimed no memory of the events. However, as the interrogation progressed, she began to articulate a narrative that merged religious doctrine, personal grievance, and apparent delusion. "The angel came to me as he came to Abraham," she stated on the record. "He showed me how the sacrifice would make me fruitful. The barren woman shall become the mother of multitudes, if she proves her worthiness through obedience." As the questioning continued, Sarah described an elaborate theology that had developed in her mind over the preceding months, a syncretic blend of Mormon doctrine, biblical narrative, and what appears to have been hallucinatory experience. "The angel revealed that my barrenness was a divine test, similar to Abraham's command to sacrifice Isaac. By demonstrating my willingness to sacrifice that which was most precious to Ephraim, his other wives and their children, I would prove my worthiness to bear the children of the covenant. The angel promised that from my womb would come a new race of priesthood bearers who would restore the kingdom in its fullness." Most disturbing were the ritual elements she described incorporating into the killings, drawing apparent inspiration from both temple ceremonies and frontier butchering practices. Each throat was cut from ear to ear, following the pattern shown to me by the angel, the same that Father Abraham would have used had the ram not been provided. Ephraim's sacrifice required greater ceremony, as befitted his priesthood authority. His body was opened in the pattern of the temple veil, and his seed-bearing organs prepared as an offering to ensure the blessing of fertility would pass to me. Forensic evidence, primitive by modern standards but carefully documented by Dr. Woodruff, indicated that Sarah had systematically slaughtered the household while they slept, having first administered significant doses of laudanum, likely accumulated from the prescriptions intended for her own use. Most disturbing was the evidence suggesting that Ephraim Bennion had been conscious during his death, apparently restrained and subjected to an amateur surgical procedure focused on his reproductive organs. Court documents delicately refer to this as mutilation consistent with ritualistic intent, rather than conventional homicidal rage. The most chilling aspect of the forensic evidence was the methodical nature of the killings. Dr. Woodruff's examination revealed that the murders had occurred in a specific sequence, beginning with the older children who might have posed the greatest resistance, proceeding to the wives, and concluding with the youngest children. The time required for this systematic slaughter, estimated at over 4 hours, suggests a level of determination and ritualistic commitment that transcended mere homicidal impulse. Most significant was the evidence that Sarah had apparently bathed and changed clothing between each group of killings, an action interpreted by alienists as indicating a ritualistic purification process consistent with her quasi-religious conceptualization of the murders. The Deseret News of March 1896 covered the case with remarkable restraint, referring only to quote, "tragic events of an unusual nature that had befallen a respected family of our territorial days." This journalistic discretion was likely motivated by the precarious political situation facing Utah's nascent state government, which was eager to demonstrate that polygamy and its associated social problems were firmly in the past. Official church publications made no mention of the incident whatsoever. Were it not for the meticulous record-keeping of local authorities and the preservation efforts of the Utah Historical Society, this disturbing case might have been entirely expunged from our historical memory. The contrast between public silence and private reaction was stark. While official channels maintained discreet silence, private correspondence reveals the profound impact of the murders on local communities. A letter from Manti resident Caroline Hansen to her sister in Salt Lake City, dated March 10, 1896, conveys the atmosphere of collective shock. The entire town exists in a state of subdued terror. Doors that have stood unlocked for decades are now bolted at dusk. Children are no longer permitted to wander unaccompanied, and several families with plural arrangements have hastily dispatched secondary wives to relatives in distant settlements. Bishop Madsen delivered a sermon obliquely referencing the tragedy, cautioning against excessive religious enthusiasm and unsanctioned personal revelation. The name Benyan is spoken only in whispers, if at all. Dr. Henrietta Robinson, a visiting alienist from the California Medical Society who examined Sarah Benyan during her incarceration, left perhaps the most insightful contemporary analysis of the case. Her report, filed with the territorial court and preserved in the Utah State Archives, represents an early example of forensic psychological assessment. The subject demonstrates a complex delusional structure centered on fertility, divine communion, and sacrificial theology, Robinson wrote. She has constructed an alternative interpretation of religious principles that justified the elimination of those she perceived as obstacles to her reproductive fulfillment. Of particular note is her appropriation and distortion of temple ceremonies, which she describes in terms suggesting a profound misunderstanding of their spiritual intent. Robinson's analysis continued with observations that were remarkably prescient given the limited psychiatric understanding of the era. Mrs. Benyan's condition represents a dangerous convergence of religious fervor, personal grievance, and probable underlying mental pathology. Her barrenness, which in her cultural context represented a profound failure of feminine purpose, became integrated into an apocalyptic religious framework that transformed personal inadequacy into divine testing. The isolation imposed by both geography and her increasingly marginal position within the household removed the social constraints that might otherwise have checked her developing psychosis. Most concerning is the evident influence of sanctioned religious narratives, of sacrifice, covenant, and divine testing, which provided a template for her distorted reasoning. Sarah Benyan never stood trial for the murders. On April 17, 1896, she was found dead in her cell at the territorial prison, having fashioned a ligature from her own clothing. A sealed letter addressed to Wilford Woodruff was discovered among her possessions, though church authorities reportedly destroyed this document without revealing its contents. The official inquest ruled her death a suicide, closing what the presiding judge termed a most unfortunate chapter in our community's transition to statehood. The two surviving children, Joseph and infant Rebecca, were placed with Ephraim's brother in Salt Lake City. Church records indicate that Joseph later served a mission to the southern states, while Rebecca eventually married into a prominent Provo family, her connection to the Manti tragedy apparently unknown to her descendants until a genealogical researcher uncovered it in the 1970s. The family name was altered slightly to Benson shortly after the children's relocation, likely in an attempt to distance them from the notorious events. The implications of the Benyan family tragedy extended far beyond the immediate horror of the crime itself. For historians of the Mormon experience, the case represents a stark illustration of the psychological toll exacted by the abrupt transition away from plural marriage. The practice, which had been central to Mormon identity and theology for nearly 50 years, could not simply be abandoned without significant social consequences. Families like the Benyans found themselves caught between competing imperatives, religious tradition on one hand, and the demands of assimilation into mainstream American society on the other. Dr. Thomas Blackburn of the Harvard Medical School, writing in an 1899 monograph on crimes of religious significance, suggested that the Benyan case represented a perfect storm of destabilizing influences, the psychological vulnerability of a woman defined by reproductive failure in a pronatalist culture, the stress of a household arrangement suddenly delegitimized by both church and state authority, and the isolation imposed by geography and climate. This analysis, though limited by the psychiatric understanding of its era, nonetheless identifies the complex interplay of factors that transformed a troubled domestic situation into a scene of unimaginable violence. The physical evidence from the Benyan case has been preserved in the special collections of the Utah State Historical Society. Particularly notable is a journal recovered from Sarah's personal effects, containing entries that document her progressive psychological deterioration. The earlier pages show conventional religious devotion and acceptance of her role within the plural household. By late 1895, however, the entries become increasingly disordered, mixing scriptural quotations with apparent hallucinations. "The angel came again," reads an entry dated January 15, 1896. "He showed me the true meaning of Abraham's test. To receive the blessing of fertility, I must prove my worthiness through a greater sacrifice than has yet been asked of any woman in Zion. The others stand between me and the fulfillment of God's promise." The journal's final entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, document Sarah's conviction that she had been selected for a messianic role. "I am to be the mother of the new dispensation," she wrote on February 20th, just 2 days before the murders. "As the first Sarah gave her handmaid to Abraham, only to later bear the child of promise herself, so shall I be rewarded for my greater sacrifice. The angel has promised that when the blood offering is complete, my womb will quicken with the seed of Ephraim, transformed and purified through the sacred ordinance to be performed. The children, born of this union, will establish Zion in its fullness, and gather the pure in heart from the 4 quarters of the earth." These writings, analyzed by subsequent generations of scholars, suggest a complex psychopathology in which religious symbolism, reproductive anxiety, and paranoid delusion converge to create a lethal ideology. Dr. Margaret Iverson, writing in the American Journal of Forensic Psychiatry in 1998, characterized Sarah's condition as a case of psychotic depression with religious preoccupation, likely exacerbated by the social stressors inherent in her polygamous situation and the pharmacological effects of chronic laudanum use. The journal entries, Iverson suggested, document the progressive construction of a delusional system that ultimately enabled Sarah to reconcile her murderous impulses with her religious identity. What makes the Benyan case particularly significant for students of Utah's transition to statehood is how it embodied the unresolved tensions surrounding polygamy's official abandonment. The manifesto of 1890 had created a legal fiction that plural marriage had simply ceased when the reality was far more complex. Thousands of existing plural marriages continued while new ones were sometimes conducted in secret. This ambiguous situation created profound stress within affected communities, as families navigated between public compliance and private commitment to what many still considered a divinely ordained practice. The Benyan case was not the only instance of violence associated with this transitional period. Court records from throughout the Mormon corridor document an increase in domestic disturbances, assaults, and even homicides within plural families during the decade following the manifesto. A particularly troubling pattern emerged involving excess wives, those who, like Sarah Benyan, occupied the most vulnerable positions in the newly delegitimized system. Without legal standing or economic security, these women faced stark choices: remain in increasingly untenable domestic arrangements, attempt to establish independent households with minimal resources, or return to extended families who had often severed contact upon their entry into plural marriages. Professor Emerita Catherine Winters of the University of Utah's Department of Historical Demography has conducted extensive research into the demographic patterns of post-manifesto polygamous families. Her findings, published in the Journal of Mormon History, indicate that women in Sarah Benyan's position, third or fourth wives, especially those without children, experienced particularly acute social and psychological pressures during this transitional period. These women often found themselves in a sort of limbo. Winters writes, "Their marriages, once sources of religious status, were now legally nullified and increasingly viewed with embarrassment by the broader community. Without children to cement their position in the family structure, they were particularly vulnerable to marginalization. Statistical analysis of census records and church membership rolls reveals a disturbing pattern. Third and fourth wives were significantly more likely to experience poverty, displacement, and mental health crises in the post-manifesto period. Their suicide rate was approximately 3 times that of first wives, and nearly 6 times that of monogamous women of comparable age and background. These stark figures suggest that while the Benyan case represented an extreme manifestation, the psychological stressors that contributed to Sarah's breakdown were widespread throughout the community of marginalized plural wives. The architectural layout of the Benyan home, documented in county property records, reveals another dimension of the family's unusual situation. Unlike many polygamous households where each wife maintained a separate residence, the Benyans shared a single structure, with designated areas for each wife and her children. This arrangement, likely motivated by economic necessity, would have intensified the interpersonal dynamics at play. According to the testimony of surviving family members, Sarah occupied the smallest room, significantly separated from the family's common areas, a physical manifestation of her increasingly peripheral status within the household. Contemporary architectural historians have analyzed the implications of such spatial arrangements for family dynamics. Dr. Jonathan Howell of the University of California, in his study of polygamous domestic spaces, notes that physical proximity without social integration created unique psychological stressors in shared households. The architectural marginalization of lower-status wives relegated to smaller, peripheral spaces, while remaining within earshot of the family's primary activities, likely exacerbated feelings of exclusion and resentment. The Benyan home's layout, with Sarah's quarters accessible only through an external entrance rather than connecting to the main household circulation, represents what Howell terms architectural excommunication, a physical reinforcement of social boundaries within the domestic sphere. In the decades following the Benyan murders, the case acquired an almost mythological status within certain Utah communities. Oral histories collected by the Daughters of Utah Pioneers include numerous accounts of the Manti murder house, which allegedly remained vacant for years afterward, its increasingly dilapidated condition serving as a physical reminder of the tragedy. Local folklore attributed supernatural phenomena to the property, with reports of lights appearing in the abandoned structure and the sounds of children's voices heard by those who ventured too close after dark. These folkloric elements, while historically unreliable, nevertheless demonstrate how the case entered the communal memory as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism. The folkloric transformation of the Benyan tragedy included significant distortions of the historical record. In some accounts, Sarah became a sympathetic figure, a woman driven to desperate measures by her husband's cruelty and her sister wives' machinations. Other versions cast her as a witch who had made a covenant with dark forces to secure fertility through blood sacrifice. By the mid-20th century, the story had become a staple of regional ghost lore, often recounted at youth gatherings and scout campouts. Its historical specificity gradually replaced by generic elements common to rural American horror tales. When the property was finally sold in 1912, the new owners demolished the original structure, reportedly burning the materials rather than repurposing them, a practice sometimes associated with sites of violent death in Mormon folk belief. The current structure on the property, a farmhouse built in the 1920s, bears no visible connection to the events of 1896, though local residents still occasionally refer to it as the Benyan Place when providing directions to visitors unfamiliar with the area's history. What remains most disturbing about the Benyan case, viewed through the lens of modern understanding, is how it illustrates the potential consequences when religious doctrine, psychological vulnerability, and social transition intersect. Sarah Benyan's actions, while clearly the product of a profoundly disturbed mind, occurred within a specific historical and cultural context that cannot be separated from the violence itself. The communal silence that descended upon the case, the reluctance of official publications to acknowledge it, the apparent destruction of certain records, suggests a recognition of this uncomfortable truth by contemporary authorities. The institutional response to the Benyan murders reflected broader patterns of communal denial regarding the social costs of polygamy's abandonment. Church authorities, eager to present the transition as divinely ordained and smoothly implemented, had little incentive to acknowledge the psychological casualties of the process. Historical theologian Dr. Eleanor Richards has documented a pattern of selective institutional memory regarding this period, noting that official histories emphasized the faithful compliance of members with the manifesto, while eliding the profound disruption experienced by thousands of plural families. Cases like the Benyan tragedy, which dramatically illustrated the human cost of the transition, were systematically excluded from institutional narratives, creating a sanitized account that served immediate political needs but distorted historical understanding. The legacy of the Benyan murders extends beyond the immediate tragedy to illuminate broader themes in Utah's complex transition from theocratic territory to American state. The case demonstrates how the formal abandonment of polygamy, while politically necessary for statehood, created profound disruptions within families that had structured their entire existence around this distinctive practice. For individuals like Sarah Benyan, whose identity and status were inextricably linked to a suddenly delegitimized institution, the psychological consequences could be severe. While few responded with violence, many experienced forms of dislocation and identity crisis that would shape Utah society for generations. Contemporary sociological research suggests that the effects of this transition continued to reverberate through Mormon culture well into the 20th century. The abrupt abandonment of plural marriage created what sociologist Armin Maus termed a doctrinal vacuum, a situation where theological principles remained officially intact while the practices they had authorized were prohibited. This contradiction fostered both splinter movements committed to preserving polygamy and mainstream psychological adaptations that Dr. Claudia Bushman has characterized as theological compartmentalization, the capacity to maintain contradictory beliefs about the eternal validity of plural marriage and its contemporary prohibition. As we close our examination of this disturbing chapter in Utah's history, the Benyan homestead photograph takes on new significance. The three women on the porch, Mary, Elizabeth, and Sarah, stand as representatives of a unique social experiment that was already ending when the image was captured. Their expressionless faces, conforming to the photographic conventions of the era, reveal nothing of the complex dynamics at work within their shared household. Yet behind this unremarkable facade lay tensions that would ultimately erupt in an act of violence so extreme that contemporary society could barely acknowledge it. The photograph itself, considered as historical evidence, presents intriguing questions. The positioning of the three women, Mary and Elizabeth seated close together while Sarah stands slightly apart, may reflect the household's actual social configuration. Ephraim's placement behind them all, his hand resting on Mary's shoulder rather than Sarah's, likewise suggests the hierarchy that had developed within the family. Yet the very existence of the photograph indicates an attempt to present the plural household as a unified family unit, a representation that contradicted both its internal reality and its increasingly problematic legal status. In this sense, the image itself embodies the contradiction at the heart of post-manifesto polygamy, the maintenance of appearances increasingly at odds with underlying realities. The Benyan family tragedy, long obscured by institutional reticence and the passage of time, reminds us that historical transitions rarely proceed as smoothly as official narratives suggest. Behind the political milestone of Utah statehood lay countless personal adjustments, compromises, and sometimes catastrophic failures to adapt. In this sense, the Manti murders serve as a dark counterpoint to the celebratory history of Utah's entrance into the Union, a reminder that progress often exacts a hidden cost from those caught between worlds, between eras, between competing conceptions of divine will and human obligation.